Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 10th of February. And last class, basically, I introduced the course. I reviewed the syllabus, I reviewed the course outline. I didn't get a chance, though, I believe, to talk about the plagiarism section, so I wanted to just briefly touch on that. And that plagiarism is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And it's a fairly serious academic offense. If you were to be caught plagiarizing, at the very least, you would fail that assignment. At the very most, you would be expelled from college with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And I always give two stories to indicate why students should not be tempted to plagiarize. The first occurred to me early on in my career, which meant that I didn't have internet resources to be able to find out whether or not the student was plagiarizing, because as many sources that exist for students to help them plagiarize, an equal number exists for instructors to determine if students are plagiarizing. One of my favorites is called Turnitin.com, where basically I can type in a sentence or a paragraph and do a database search. But I didn't have those resources at that particular time. I had to rely on my memory. And as I was looking at this paper, I realized why I recognized it. It was actually from our own class textbook that I had assigned, as if I wouldn't notice, with a few errors here and there, either because this person was sloppy when they plagiarized or because they were deliberately trying to fool me about their plagiarizing. The second story is much better, though. Happened around the same time period. Not to me, but it was in all the academic newspapers. There are academic newspapers. And this occurred to a middle-aged professor. That part's important. And he's reading a series of papers, and basically he recognizes something. And again, he can't go to the internet to verify. And as he's reviewing that, and he's thinking to himself, where have I read this before? Where have I read? And then it occurs to him he hadn't read it before. He had basically written it himself when he was an undergraduate student decades earlier in college. And I don't know all the details. It has something to do with the fraternity that was recycling papers from former fraternity members. But somehow, some way, this poor student, and I do feel somewhat sorry for this student, got a hold of his old professor's work and submitted it into the original author. And what are the odds? So I use those two stories as examples of why it's not a good idea to try to plagiarize, almost like cheating on your taxes. If you get caught, you're in quite a bit of trouble. If you'll remember, I had talked about that the assignments we'll be doing this semester in terms of writing are critical writing assignments. You're not doing outside research. That said, if you have your heart set on outside research, we can certainly negotiate. But my hope and goal is that by the ending of the semester, you have an ability to read and analyze literature on your own without necessarily having to rely on a teacher or classmates. So I'd prefer that you stay away from outside sources. So hopefully that'll reduce the temptation for plagiarism, if there ever was any temptation. So for today, I view this as an introductory class about what literature is and how to read it. And then we begin to actually get into the actual pieces of literature, the short story, which is how we are beginning next class. So I wanted you to read, and I'm hopeful that you were able to do so. But if not, that's fine. You can go back and reread it when you have access to the text. Reading imaginative literature, which is pages 1 through 7. Critical strategies about reading, pages 1641 to 1662. Reading fiction, pages 13 to 22. And writing about fiction, 46 through 65. So basically, in terms of reading imaginative literature, and again, keep in mind we're not reading the literature yet, so this is basically just informational, that literature does not lend itself to a tidy definition. And that's on page 1, and that's a quote, and that's very important because we're going to spend the entire semester trying to define what literature is. Some suggestions I have is that literature is a piece of writing, obviously, but I think it's different, the kind of literature that we would study in an academic classroom than the kind of literature that we might read outside of an academic classroom. And certainly, in the broadest sense of the word, literature is any piece of writing. So I could go into, let's say, an appliance store and ask for some literature about their appliance. What I'm asking for is just some information, the instruction manual, for instance. But that's nothing that really is creative or artistic. It's purely to convey information. That's not the kind of literature that we would be studying in a literature class. And even those pieces of writing that are artistic and convey information, some have more depth and sophistication than others, which is what we will be talking about next class when we read our first two short stories. And I think it'll be pretty obvious which one is considered a piece of academic literature that is worth academic study and which is written mostly for profit and entertainment. That's known as formula fiction because it follows particular criteria. There isn't much creativity or artistry there. But I would say that literature helps to broaden our perspectives, as you can see that I've listed in the notes below, as I'll always have the notes below all of these videos. It does entertain, yes, but it does more than entertain. It provides some kind of social commentary. Now, you don't have to agree necessarily with the commentary that the author is making, but you do need to be able to identify it. And it uses language in interesting ways. I could say that I find someone attractive, or I could say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. And obviously, I'm saying the same thing, but it's a very different approach to saying that. So one is pretty informative and the other is artistic, and I hope you could differentiate which is which. The idea of using language in interesting ways is something that we will be examining throughout the course of this semester. And note that literature and its definition can oftentimes be subjective. We need to make a determination of what criteria we're looking for and who is making that criteria. This gets to the idea of canon, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study. So there are probably some major names, Shakespeare included, that you've heard of in the past, and you know that they're supposed to have some value, but you may not even know why they have value. But it's the sort of thing that you're supposed to read in class. The problem with the canon, those scholars and critics, particularly in the past, represented a very small group in terms of demographics. Usually male, usually middle-aged, usually Caucasian, usually Christian, usually heterosexual, usually, you get the idea. So as school systems began to reform and change in their populace, when students became more diverse, they began asking questions about where is my voice and where is my identity in the canon. So there's been a good amount of controversy about canon. Should we stick to, quote, the classics, which are sometimes known as the dead white males, and these are the Chaucers and the Shakespeares? Or should we expand the canon, but that means adding on additional works? Or should we abandon the classics and focus more on contemporary works and also works from different demographic groups? And most individuals take the mid approach, the compromise approach, that you do a little bit of both. I take that approach, and so does our text. The difficulty means is that there's additional reading, but I think it's quite valuable to be able to see how the past has influenced the present. Just like with any artist, you can see this with musicians as well, where they say they create their own works, but they've been influenced by the past works. So knowing the canon, but also expanding the canon, I think is something that's important in terms of literature. And that there can be debate about what is considered worthy and not worthy. Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which is considered to be a great canonical work, was initially identified by scholars and critics as not a piece of literature, but basically as a study of whales. And that's where it was in the library until it was, quote, rediscovered, unquote. And now all of a sudden it's become one of those major works in literature, that the whale is a symbol or a representational idea. So the canon can be somewhat subjective. Now, individuals turn this, the reading and interpreting of literature, into an academic discipline. That's what I wanted to talk about today under critical strategies for reading. And again, this is a very simplified view of what happened. I took an entire semester in graduate school reviewing all of the different schools of literary interpretation. But basically, what critical strategies for reading is trying to talk about is the history of literary criticism, which began in around the late 1800s, the early 1900s, where a group of individuals decided to make this into an academic discipline, the reading and the interpretation of literature. They needed to call themselves something. Whenever you are creating a professional group, you need to have common language. And they called themselves the formalists because they were examining the formal elements of a work. Things like language and structure and tone and irony, things that we've become accustomed to with examining literature. Starting around the 1940s or the 1950s or so, the job market got a little bit tighter. I think this was one of the motivating reasons why there was a call to have a different way of analyzing literature. And these individuals needed to call themselves something. What they called themselves were the new critics. I think that's an unfortunate term because they are no longer new, because this happened in the 40s to the 60s. So then what do you call yourself after the 60s? The new critics? I'm not exactly sure. But at any rate, they focused on close reading of the text, that you didn't necessarily have to have a lot of background and language and things like a structure and tone and the formal elements of a work. That regardless of where you were, you could read a piece of literature. As long as you were able to read, then ultimately you can interpret. Obviously, the more background you've got, the better ability you've got to be able to interpret. But again, anybody at any level, even in elementary school, can read a particular work and see what they can find in that particular work. And that made it very appealing to a broader group of people, that you didn't necessarily have to have specialized training in order to understand a piece of literature. Then lots of subgroups sort of branched off of that, and they also needed to call themselves something. Luckily, they oftentimes chose terminology that was pretty intuitive in terms of what they would focus on in a particular work. The biographical critics, they focused on biography, author's biography, and how that could be related to our understanding of the work. Makes sense that an author's past life or even current life would influence their writing. But just because an author has had a life experience, that doesn't necessarily mean it's reflected in their writing. They are writing creatively, after all. And in addition to that, we may not have accurate information about the author's biography, so there are limits to that. Psychological critics examine psychology, whether it be the psychology of the author, and that what motivated them to write their work, the psychology of the characters, treating them as unique individuals to try to understand their motivations and their needs and desires, or even the psychology of the readers and why they interpreted a work in a particular way. And we can get much more detailed. For instance, you could be a Freudian critic, which is a psychological critic, but you use the theories of Freud in terms of interpreting a work. Historical critics talked about the importance of understanding the history of the time in which the piece was written and past events in order to understand that time. Now, all of these approaches have a certain level of value, but they also have limitations. Think about, for instance, the historical critics. It makes perfect sense that in order to understand Shakespeare, you would need to know the history of the English Renaissance. But that's very time-consuming and difficult, knowing the history of the English Renaissance. So in theory, that would mean that you aren't ready to read anything from the English Renaissance until you've learned its history first. And that doesn't necessarily sound very practical. So I think you should take all of these approaches with a grain of salt and realize that rather than trying to focus on a particular way to interpret literature, instead let the literature determine for you what a particular mode might be that would be useful to interpret it. So some pieces might lend themselves more to psychological analysis. Some might lend themselves more to Marxist analysis. The Marxist critics, they use the theories of Karl Marx in economics about class and socioeconomic structure in order to examine the works. Notice how interdisciplinary this is that oftentimes there was a combination of studying literature but through the lens of another discipline. New historicist critics, because remember, we had historical critics before, so they had to call themselves something. They call themselves new historicist critics, that they weren't just studying the history of the times, the facts of things like dates and so forth, but the cultural context, things like the behaviors, the attitudes, the values, and the beliefs of a society. Not just the politics of the society, but what people did to entertain themselves or what the fashions were. And that gave you an insight into understanding that people's or understanding that piece of literature. Gender critics focused on gender, and you can focus on masculine, you can focus on feminine, you can focus on non-binary. If you're focusing on feminine, then you would be called a feminist critic. Mythological critics use mythology in order to be able to evaluate a text. These are the traditional and legendary cultural stories that society after society and culture after culture share. The great myths, that the details might be different, but basically the generalities are similar. For instance, every culture has a resurrection myth. And of course, the stories might be different, the details might be different, but every culture that exists has some sort of a resurrection myth. And the idea is that whether or not that's a psychological response to fears of death, because the idea of resurrection implies that there's something more than death, or whether or not this is a religious motivator, or whether or not it's a philosophical motivator in cultures can be debated, but that ultimately it is true that there are stories about rebirth and renewal in every cultural group. Reader response is a particularly interesting theory, and the reason why is because the focus is on the reader rather than on the writer. Thus far, we've been focusing on the writer and the writer's ability to be able to communicate message to us as reader. The idea behind reader response is that we interpret message. Now, don't think that this means it's completely subjective, that I as the reader could just determine meaning and say, well, this is my response, my reader response to this poem, so that's what it means and I'm correct. No, you have to have a group of readers that agree with you. And not just because they're your friends or because you've gathered together and decided to agree together. That there is evidence in the text in order to be able to support it. And that's going to be key for us this semester. That whatever position we take about the literature, a position upon which reasonable people could disagree, we have to reference the text. We are almost like courtroom attorneys who are presenting evidence to a judge and jury. And a good attorney can argue either side. And it's just, and the evidence obviously is the same. It's the question of which pieces of evidence do you pick and choose if you're going to be the defense or you're going to be the prosecution. And ultimately, it's up to the judge and the jury to decide. And what you need to do is to be as compelling and convincing as possible. But the judge and the jury, they make a decision on one position, either guilty or innocent. Luckily, I'm not in that position. I can take two papers with two completely contrasting positions, and they can both be A papers, assuming there's enough evidence in the text in order to be able to support that particular position. Which gets me to the last theory that I wanted to talk about today, but there are many theories out there. Deconstruction, which was a very popular theory in the 1980s and the 1990s. And deconstruction means to take apart. And particularly, this was a philosophical theory from a French theorist, Frank Derrida, I should say, or Jacques Derrida, where he was arguing that if we were to deconstruct a text, what we would find is contradiction, that contradiction exists everywhere. It's almost like adding a positive and a negative number. What ends up happening is you get zero, nothing. That the contradictions cross each other out, and then there is no meaning, there is no center. And for a while, it was a very, very popular theory. And until people began questioning the idea of, well, aren't you assuming that your own theory, that there is no meaning, has meaning? And then people began wondering if this was really that interesting of a way of examining literature. Plus, the idea of examining literature to determine that it has no meaning and it has no censor. I don't know if that's necessarily a very productive way to examine literature. It seems very nihilistic in some respects. But nevertheless, once individuals began noticing that Jacques Derrida's words were implied to have meaning, even though he suggested there was no meaning, people began scratching their heads and becoming less interested in this. Of course, the response is that his own words would be contradictory because everything else is contradictory. But by that point, again, he had lost a lot of his cachet. So these are just brief overviews of the way that you can examine literature. And what I suggest to you is that you very closely focus on the text and allow the text to make determinations for you, understanding that you can mix and match these different approaches. Though occasionally what you might find is one approach suits a reading much better than another. And we'll see that with some of the short stories that I've selected. So then I had another element for you entitled Reading Fiction, pages 13 through 22, about the importance of reading carefully, not just reading for plot. And I usually suggest 3 readings of a piece of literature. In fact, that happens to be my shorthand version of how to define a piece of literature, something that could be reread and still bring additional meaning to it. That you wouldn't need to reread the newspaper or the instruction manual for the vacuum cleaner once you've understood the content. But a piece of literature you can reread over and over again and continue to have new insight and find new meanings. So that means that you need to do multiple readings, and they need to be careful and deliberate readings. And what I suggest you do is that you read once just for plot, to try to understand what's happening. And then you read a second time for analysis, where you try to understand why those things are happening. So the first reading is what is happening. The second reading is why are those things happening. And the third reading is immediately before class or when you are going to be engaging in that reading additionally, because you want to refresh your memory. And I understand that might not always be a possibility, that sometimes all you can manage is just one reading. But obviously, each time you've reread something, you can bring additional insight into it. So you can catch all kinds of details that you might have missed in the past. So if you've read some of these texts before, that's actually a good thing. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't read them. No, you should reread them and read them very carefully. Obviously, you'll have an advantage over somebody who's never read these particular texts. But we have to start somewhere. And this is an introduction to literature. So the assumption is that you haven't read any of these upcoming texts. Though if you have read them in the past, then that's a wonderful thing. So in addition, when you are reading a text, you should be annotating, which means taking notes in the margin. And we actually have an example of annotation on page 17 of the textbook. The textbook is also on reserve in the GCC library, by the way, if you needed to access it. Page 17 would be for the edition that I ordered for the class, though of course you can order other editions. This was an example of the short story, The Story of an Hour, which we will be revisiting again next week. But that example of annotation, you'll see that somebody put notes in the margin when they were reading it. And they identified things like the possible significance of the title, or the names in the story, or some of the creative use of language. So these were the thoughts that were occurring to them as they were reading. Not just reading for plot, but trying to understand how this piece was put together. And I encourage you to do that. It's why you have all of those white margins in most of your textbooks. It's why you're paying additional money for additional papers so that you can write notes. But I know that sometimes individuals are hesitant because they want to sell back their books. As long as it's not overly annotated, you should be able to sell back your book. But regardless, if you don't want to write in your book, you could easily write this on a separate sheet of paper or on a computer screen. And that's what I was thinking about in terms of journals, that this is going to be an assignment in our class. It'll be a component of our course that I'm going to ask you in the short story unit to select 3 of the short stories. We would have read, I don't know, 8 or 10 or so. So out of those, select 3. And for each of those 3, write about a page or so response of thoughts, comments, reflections that you have about that short story. So if you're writing a page for each short story and you're writing on 3 short stories, then you should have a total of approximately 3 pages. And think of it as your note taking. Again, it doesn't have to be formal. I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, purely for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And the idea, again, behind the journal is that ultimately it's a way for you to document your thoughts and questions before you begin to forget them, because we tend to have pretty poor memories. So it can be as simple as that, just a list of ideas or thoughts. It can certainly be more detailed. And the textbook gives you an example on page 20. Again, somebody's writing about a piece of a short story. And what they're writing about is somewhat between, I would say, a journal, which is pretty informal, but also they are writing about something like they're writing something that seems much more in depth, as if they were beginning to play around with the idea of constructing a paper, which is wonderful, because eventually you are going to have to write a paper for the class, and we will talk about writing papers as the semester progresses. So the idea of using the journals as a kind of drafting tool for writing a paper is wonderful. So if you look at that detailed journal that they're writing, page 20, you can see that they've got complete sentences and paragraphs, which you don't necessarily have to have in your journal assignment. That's looking like a paper. That's wonderful, because then, again, if they were going to write a paper, they've done a lot of the work. But also what you will see is that they're making references to family members and their responses to the reading. Again, that wouldn't be appropriate in an academic paper, because you should be writing from your perspective of the reading, not talking about your grandmother, for instance. So that's something you can do in a journal, but you wouldn't do that in an academic paper. So I see that as sort of a combination of the two. Now, writing about fiction. On pages 46 to 65, what you will see on page 47 is a list of questions about plot and character and setting. And if we think about things like plot, it's just the action that occurs. Character, the individuals who are in the story. Setting, the time in which the story takes place and the location in which the story takes place. Symbolism, something that's representational, when something stands for something else. Something concrete, for instance, like a flag, can represent or symbolize something much more abstract, such as patriotism. This is a very common symbol, but some of the symbols used may not be so common. Theme, what is the major issue or idea, or what are the major issues or ideas examined in a text? Style, in other words, the use of language, and how is that language used to communicate the idea. Tone, the feelings behind that language, the emotions. Is it humorous? Is it sad? Is it angry? Irony, and irony can be a difficult thing to define. Basically, it's something that's unexpected, but it's more than just something that's unexpected. It's something that has a twist. So, for instance, it would be ironic when a firehouse burns down, because firefighters basically put out fires. So it couldn't be just something that's unexpected. Oh, I didn't think that classes would be canceled, but they are. So that's not necessarily ironic. But it might be ironic that the one day that you decide that you're not going to campus, the day you decide to take off is the day that classes are canceled. So that means that in one way or another, you're not either going to benefit from that class cancellation, or you're also not going to experience harm from that class cancellation. And both might seem somewhat ironic to you. Best example I have of irony is actually from a television show from the 1950s, one of my favorite television shows, called The Twilight Zone. They had some of the best short story writers of the day writing for them. And in one episode entitled Time Enough at Last, there's an individual who is basically pretty mousy and rather shy. He works in a bank, and he basically is bullied by his boss and co-workers. And he's married, but he also is bullied by his spouse. All he really wants is time to read, but of course at work they want him to do tasks, and at home his spouse also wants him to do chores. So it turns out that one day he ends up locking himself in the bank vault by mistake in the middle, at the ending of the day, so he has to spend the night there. And it turns out that when he is locked in that vault, a nuclear war erupts and it destroys society. However, he survives because he was protected by the vault. And we have to suspend some disbelief here. And as he leaves the vault in the rubbles, at first he's horrified when he sees the devastation of society. And then he realizes this is not necessarily such a bad thing, because now he has time enough at last to read. He doesn't have to worry about his work responsibilities or his home responsibilities. So he wanders off to the rubbles of a library. Again, we have to suspend some disbelief here that the books in the library would survive something like that. And he gathers a bunch of books. Of course, there's a commercial right after that. And then we see that as he leans down to look at his books, his eyeglasses, which are quite thick, the lenses, they slip off of his face and they shatter on the ground, because during that time, lenses were made out of glass rather than plastic. And he can't see without his glasses. So now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And that's irony. There are other elements, too, to consider. For instance, even the critical strategies that I just was referencing, things like deconstruction and reader response. I'll go through these questions a little bit more in depth next class, and I will also talk a little bit about expectations and formulas, the idea about how some literature is written purely for entertainment and profit, probably doesn't have depth or complexity, and it probably does not require us to do rereading and interpretation. And that literature is fine for entertainment. That literature is fine to generate profit if you are the author of that or the publisher. But it's probably not worth our academic study, as compared to the exact opposite, which is a piece of writing that, yes, it might be entertaining, but that wasn't the primary reason why it was written. Yes, it might generate profit, but that wasn't necessarily the primary reason it was written. It was written for artistic creation and also to make some sort of a statement or to give some sort of a message. Now, whenever I can find these pieces of literature, what I will do is give you the links for them. And while I'm not able to find the class textbook information online because of copyright, I have been able to find just about all of the pieces of literature. So I'm not quite sure how some of that works with some of the more contemporary pieces and copyright, but I'm not going to ask questions. So whenever I can find a link to that particular piece of literature, I will direct you to that. So you can see in the notes below in section 4 where it says next class, I have a link to A Secret Sorrow, which is the first piece that we will be reading. And then I also have a link, as well as the page numbers in your text, for Sorrowful Woman. Those are the two stories we're going to compare and contrast in terms of depth. And even though they both have very similar titles, they are written in very different ways. And we'll also talk about reading in the writing process next class. So we'll start up with writing about fiction. I'll review those questions, and then we will move into the next class material. So for today's attendance question, if you'll remember, I'll be posting an attendance question for each video, and then you've got 48 hours in which to respond to that particular question. So that would be for us at Saturday, because I'm posting this on Thursday at 10 a.m. So please answer our attendance question on our class discussion forum. What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study, and why? What do you think makes a piece of literature worthy of study, and why? Remember, I've talked a little bit about some of the elements involved in studying a piece of literature and how we make some evaluative statements about, I have problems with that word, how we evaluate elements of literature. But I'm curious for your own personal definition. Remember, there are no necessarily right or wrong answers. This will just serve as your attendance for that particular class. So I am curious not in a textbook definition, but in your definition in terms of your understanding of literature. And while you aren't required to respond to your classmates, you are required to read your classmates' responses. And I'll be responding to all of you. Now, I can tell you right now, at least according to my roster, this is a very tiny class. There are 3 people in this class, which means it's going to be particularly important that all of you respond to the discussion forum questions so that you can get a sense as to what your classmates think and what we would have discussed in a classroom. So basically, I'll leave it here for today, and I'm hopeful that by next week we would have had all of our adds and drops. You would have gotten a hold of your textbook if necessary. And of course, there's a copy on reserve in the GCC library. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about, well, literature, and specifically short story. Take care. Bye-bye.